He was a scientist whose work saved thousands of lives. Dr. John Gerald FitzGerald was the man who founded Connaught Laboratories, the School of Hygiene at the University of Toronto. He made the first indigenous anti-rabies vaccine in Canada. With money that he borrowed from his wife's inheritance, he set up a basic laboratory to make diphtheria antitoxins, which ended up being distributed free to Canadians. He became Dean of Medicine at U of T. He became the scientific director of the Rockefeller Foundation. He was the first Canadian appointed to that post. And at the age of 57, he took his own life. Recently, Dr. FitzGerald was inducted into the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame. His grandson, James FitzGerald, has written about his grandfather's fascinating life. In fact, he's in the middle of working on a book on it, and he joins me in the studio. Thanks for coming in.
Hi.
This really is quite an amazing story of your grandfather. I mean, he seemed like such a driven man. You, I gather, found personal letters of his and so on that
That's right.
shed some light on his life.
Yeah, I mean, he was a very private man, and it was hard to find letters. But when I did find a cache of letters that he wrote in the last year of his life, when he was in a depression in a hospital, and these are very revealing letters. And when I got those, I decided to do the book. But going backwards in time, virtually nothing. So I have to really dig to find anything.
He was trained medically?
Yes, he entered medical school at 16 in 1903. So he was to that point the youngest ever to get into medical school at that age. So he was very precocious, very determined guy.
What was his, he must have had some kind of vision of what he wanted to do, obviously, from where he ended up.
That's right. That's what strikes me about his career. The trajectory to it is so focused, so single-minded. You get the feeling that he knew exactly what he was doing over 40 years, a series of steps that he had to take. And my own sort of insight, whatever sort of psychological insight I can get into why, is he had a very Victorian upbringing in a small town in Ontario, and he had an invalid mother, and he had a father who worked in a drugstore. And my theory is that his father's drugs were ineffectual, not helping in those days. They weren't very effective. And so I thought he had this burning ambition to get out there and make effective medicines for everybody. And
he ended up going to Paris, right?
He went to the Pasteur Institute. He went all over the world. I mean, this is what's remarkable. I mean, my grandmother, he didn't have any money, but my grandmother did. She came from an old established family, and he was able to travel to the Pasteur Institute, Lister Institute, all the international centers, Harvard, Berkeley, and got training, and then come back to Canada and sort of implement his vision.
That was that his ambition to come back to Canada and have things happen here, do things here?
At that point, when he came back, he was really the only doctor in Canada with that kind of training. He knew the biotechnology at this point, so he knew how to actually make the vaccines and create essentially the Pasteur Institute in Canada. This was before World War I. So he knew what he was doing from the beginning, but he had the expertise and the drive to do it. And he also was a very charming and persuasive character, and he was able to get philanthropists behind him. So he has Colonel Albert Gooderham of the Gooderham and Worts Distillery giving him free land for a lab and money.
Oh, really?
And then eventually down the road, the Rockefellers come on board and give him $1.2 million in the 20s. That would be the equivalent of $30 million today.
Amazing.
It is amazing. So there was a lot of faith in his ability, and he would just run with it.
But it's interesting because not often do you find they're almost like two different poles. The ability to convince people that what you're doing is so good that they're going to invest money into it. That's usually just the marketing guy's job, right?
That's right.
And then the scientist, the guy who's actually doing the work and doesn't really have that skill. They both seem to be combined in him.
That's right. He had the idealism, and he had the pragmatism, and he had the drive. And so, I mean, in some ways, his private life suffered because he was so focused and determined. I mean, I look at his life, and I sort of sometimes take a deep breath and say, I wish he had more fun, because he was so determined. At one point, his wife was quoted as saying, "I didn't marry a man, I married an idea." And he was obsessed with this idea and implementing it.
Setting up the lab at first, I mean, I said in the introduction, you know, borrowing money off of his wife's inheritance, I guess, through your grandmother and so on. Did he know what he wanted to do? Like, I guess seeing the Pasteur Institute and everything, he knew.
That's right. And I think his great contribution was that he saw what the Europeans and the Americans were doing, and then he did a very Canadian thing. He sort of fused them and then one-upped them. And he took a new idea, and this was unprecedented. This was revolutionary at the time, to integrate teaching, research, and manufacturing of medicines at a university setting. This didn't exist anywhere in the world. And at the U of T, to its credit, went with the idea, but initially they were a bit skeptical. This was very radical, and you know, the academic institutions don't sully their hands with making of manufacturing vaccines, and so he was impatient at this point. When they were deferring on a decision, he borrows money from my grandmother and races ahead, buys a barn, gets horses, bleeds them, does the diphtheria antitoxins, and then they're very impressed again with his commitment.
Right.
So that's when Gooderham and people come on board and say, okay, we're going to give you a lab called the Connaught Labs at the University of Toronto. And
I just find it astonishing that he goes ahead and he gets horses and stuff. I mean, he had staff and everything. I'm assuming he brought people on board.
He hired a guy. He hired a technician and then he personally made the first rabies vaccine that summer of 1913, and then the diphtheria, and that was the one that really turned their heads. And then just World War I broke out. You see, so it was historically fortuitous. The lab just exploded in size because of it had to inoculate all the troops in Europe. So you have anti-meningitis serum and smallpox, and you have right down the line. And then, of course, another historical accident in 1921, 7 years after the lab was founded, Banting and Best discover insulin. So again, that sort of ratchets up the lab, and by the 20s, there's all this international focus on Toronto and insulin and the lab, and again, more money, Rockefeller money coming in. So within 10 years, all of a sudden, Canada is now a world-class player in a way that we weren't. We were quite a backwater before World War I.
And that lab became, basically, it became the Pasteur, it became one of, on the same level.
He wanted to call it that, my grandfather.
Did he?
He wanted to call it the Pasteur Institute of Canada, and one of the stipulations by Gooderham was that they name it after the Duke of Connaught, who was the Governor General of Canada, and who was very interested in public health. So it was very British, you know, people.
So while all this was going on, he's how old?
He was, I guess, 19. He'd be in his late 20s.
His late 20s?
He's still young when he's doing this, And he actually took a bypass. Initially, he was in psychiatry. You see, he took 5 years in psychiatry, and then kind of bacteriology, pathology, psychiatry. And I think he got frustrated that he couldn't do anything. He worked at 999 Queen Street, the infamous asylum in Toronto, working with C.K. Clark, and he was the first pathologist. And I think he saw, you know, schizophrenia and extreme madness, and he realized he couldn't, in his own lifetime, he probably couldn't affect much change. So I think he switched gears. So, well, here's something I can change. Diphtheria, I can actually wipe out, theoretically. And what's one of his great accomplishments, one of them, several that the lab did, diphtheria was wiped out in Toronto and Hamilton were the first cities in the world to have diphtheria eradicated. It took them 20 years, but they did it. And that's when everybody, the Americans and the Europeans, started to come to Toronto and say, what's this guy doing? Because he had such a integrated system. The School of Hygiene had come on board in the 20s, and now he's educating doctors and fanning them out across the country. People are coming from abroad to study there. So it was really remarkable. We were world class back then.
And it's hard to, it is now from this vantage point to look back and think of that diphtheria was such a threat, you know?
That's again, one of the things I'm very proud about him is there was a class element to the problem. Before World War I, we imported medicines from the States, New York and London, and they were exorbitantly expensive. There was a diphtheria antitoxin. So it was essentially, if you were rich kids survived and poor kids died. And so there were thousands of Canadian kids dying like flies. And my grandfather was just outraged that nothing was being done about this. You had heartrending stories of them, somebody scraping the money together, what would be the equivalent of thousands of dollars today to get one dose of it, and then breaking it in half for 2 kids, and 1 kid dying, and 1 kid's not dying, and just awful stuff. So he said, I'm going to make it high quality stuff, and I'm going to distribute it free to everybody. I mean, the beginnings of the universal healthcare idea, which didn't exist then. And that's what's really, that again, it was a radical idea at the time. At those days, you had to pay for medicine. It's just real simple.
What was he? What's your sense of what he was like? There must be family stories about him and stuff. He must have some sense of the man himself.
Well, this is what's, again, one of the reasons I did the book. My father was a doctor as well. My father was an immunologist and allergist, and he grew up sort of under the shadow of his great father, but he never talked about him. When I grew up, I wasn't interested in becoming a doctor, but it intrigued me. I was reading between the lines, and I didn't discover about my grandfather's suicide until I was about 20 or something. I went to my mother one day and said, "What happened?" And she told me. And
so I didn't want to talk about it because he'd taken his own life.
That's my own sense. I think my father was so focused on his career and doing almost a carbon copy of his father's career. I mean, he was trying to equal his achievements. He wanted to found an institute in Toronto, research lab, and he had lot of pressure on him. And so as a kid, I had no knowledge of my grandfather's achievements, which is quite remarkable when you think about it.
Yeah,
you know,
especially these achievements.
That's right. And so that's maybe that's influenced me to become a writer in the long run, because I wanted to look under the rocks and find the truth behind the stories. And now that I've found it, it's quite amazing.
Yeah. He now, is there any explanation as to why he took his own life?
We have clues in the letters. One of his closest friends was the chief psychiatrist from Canada. Really, he worked at I guess with the precursor of the Clark Institute, and they were old friends from early psychiatric days. And one of the great ironies is the last year of his life, he was sent on to Hartford, which was the leading psychiatric hospital at the time. And in the late 30s, they were experimenting with insulin shock. Of course, my grandfather had made at Connaught Labs, and so he became kind of a guinea pig in the first, clinical trials for this. And he through 57 insulin shocks in 1939. It's remarkable.
I didn't know this was insulin shock to try and affect a
depression. Yeah,
depressive.
Yeah. The movie A Beautiful Mind. Yeah. There was a scene in insulin shock.
I don't recall.
And so it's an electric shock. Okay. It's since been decided a thing, but it's ironic that that's where with psychiatrists at that time. Well, at least for diabetics, would be for depression. And some of the historical irony. So during the period, he's writes 60 very intense letters to psychiatrists, and these are the only clue to why he. Quite remarkable of his life. He feels failure. It had such a standard of achievement that I mean,
he hadn't met his own standards.
He couldn't see it almost. And he acted in 3 times in one career. He only 57. And delivering phrase letters to psychiatrists says, "I have to on the cardinal in the so very God." And people have different theories about this. I don't sense that that he was and I think his effect here and that is part that I'm going to and I shut their heart and yes that's sense actually all that but he just keep repeating the phrase and, using that in the sort of the secret. And I don't yet be up for sort of talking.
Just the medical this is a thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's with bad now in 1935 was a kind of certain silence around him, and that sort of makes me wonder why. But wonderful to see our hero still celebrating world ambivalent.
Of he not
well, I sort of sat in childhood and yeah, I think he's national in the world expert. He's not. He was on sort of spiraling up to the level, and that I felt had nothing to do with that. And so he just rose, enjoys himself, and relax, and he was accomplished.
Grandmother is what
I knew her. She was a lovely. It was a very old Victorian family. Present. I was like 8 and me. And again, at that time, it was very shameful. That's like the silence.